The pack had been hunting her for 3 miles through snow that fell like a merciless verdict from the sky on the Dakota Territory. February of 1877 carved its name deep into everything living, and Millie Catherine stumbled through drifts that reached her knees, lungs burning with each ragged breath she drew. Behind her, coyotes yipped and snarled, their calls growing closer with every faltering step she managed. The wind screamed across the empty prairie like something wild and starving, driving ice crystals into her face, hard enough to draw blood from skin already raw with cold and desperation. Her boots had given up any pretense of grip 2 days ago, the soles worn through to nothing but hope and stubbornness. Now she slipped and slid across the white wasteland, leaving a trail any fool could follow. The pack knew it. These prairie wolves were patient hunters, content to let exhaustion and exposure do most of their killing work. A yellow glow flickered ahead through the blizzard's fury lamplight, bleeding from some kind of building. Salvation, maybe, or just another way to die. But the lead coyote was close enough now that she could hear its panting breath, see the shadow of its lean form cutting through the storm. She ran with everything left in her failing body. The structure was low and weathered, built from timber that had survived too many brutal winters to count. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and despite the howling wind, the rich scent of cured meat hung heavy in the air. Some kind of preservation facility. The door was solid oak, warped tight in its frame from years of prairie weather. Behind her, the alpha broke from the pack in its final rush. Millie threw herself against the door's shoulder first, putting every ounce of strength behind the impact. The iron latch gave way, and she tumbled inside, slamming the barrier shut, just as claws scraped wood where her legs had been a heartbeat before. The sudden absence of wind hit her like a physical presence. No howling, no driving snow, just the whisper of settling ash and her own desperate gasping. Salt and wood smoke filled her nostrils, familiar scents that reminded her of home before everything went wrong in Kansas. That's when she realized she wasn't alone. A man stood motionless between hanging sides of beef, his hand resting with casual familiarity on the stock of a Spencer rifle. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair, braided in the Lakota way, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail without judgment. He wore buckskin leggings and a wool shirt, practical clothes for practical work. But there was something about his perfect stillness that spoke of hunting buffalo across endless miles of free prairie before the reservations and broken treaties. "Your salt ratios are wrong," she said, because it was easier than explaining why she'd broken into his building like some kind of thief. Her voice came out rough as winter bark. "You'll lose half your stores before spring thaw if you don't adjust the brine concentration." He moved closer with the silent grace of someone who'd spent years tracking game that could hear a twig snap from 100 yards. When his hand closed around her wrist, not roughly, but with the steady pressure of someone who'd made his decision, she finally looked up into his face properly. Creekwater eyes steady and patient. A jagged scar ran from her left temple to the corner of her mouth, white against skin, burned brown by too much sun and not enough food over the past 2 months. She didn't flinch from his grip or his measuring stare. "You're half dead," he said, though his voice carried more gentleness than she'd heard from anyone in longer than she could remember. "Not yet." The words came out fiercer than she felt, but that was all she had left. "But your meat will be if you don't add more salt to that brine. The concentration won't hold past the next warm spell." Outside, the coyotes had given up their direct assault and settled into patient circling. She could hear them moving around the building's perimeter, testing for weaknesses with the methodical intelligence of predators who understood that wounded prey had to emerge eventually. The man Lakota, she realized, noting the careful way he held himself between worlds, studied her face in the lamplight, looking for madness, probably the kind that would drive someone to attempt a 2-month walk through winter conditions that killed grown men regularly. finding instead only the hollow determination of someone who'd had no choice but to run or die. "Who are you?" His English carried the precise cadence of someone who'd learned it as a second language but mastered it completely. "Mildred Catherine." She tried for dignity, fell somewhere between desperation and defiance. "Most folks call me Millie. Where did you come from?" Her free hand went instinctively to the torn hem of her dress, where something precious was sewn inside and stitched tight with her own blood when necessary. "Kansas. Been walking since December." December. The word hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. 2 months of winter prairie meant storms that could bury a standing horse, wolves that grew bold with hunger, and cold that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. Wicasa, she sensed, rather than knew his name, somehow searched her face for the kind of desperate madness that would compel such a journey. "What are you running from?" The question she'd been dreading since Kansas, the one that required speaking ugly truths aloud. "My father's debts, the contract he signed with his mark, the man who paid good silver to own me like livestock." Debt bondage, legal slavery dressed up in territorial paperwork and government seals. She watched understanding dawn in his dark eyes. He knew the system had probably seen the contracts that transformed children into collateral and daughters into negotiable property. "You got family here?" "No." She moved toward the door, on legs that trembled with exhaustion, but determination kept her upright. "I'll go. Just needed somewhere warm for a moment, and your preservation work caught my attention. I know the trade from keeping house." That's when the blizzard chose to demonstrate who really controlled this corner of Dakota territory. Wind slammed against the walls with enough force to make the entire structure groan like a living thing. Snow hissed through every crack and gap in the weathered boards, and the temperature dropped so fast she could actually feel it happening in her bones. Wicasa looked at her thin dress, patched and repatched, until more thread than original cloth, her boots held together with desperation, and leather scraps the way she swayed on her feet like a sapling in a hurricane. The mathematics of winter survival were brutal but simple. She wouldn't last an hour in conditions that were getting worse by the minute. "Weather's turning meaner," he said quietly. She nodded, already reaching for the door handle with fingers that shook from more than cold. "I'll find somewhere else." The floor rushed up to meet her, or maybe she fell toward it. Either way, darkness flickered at the edges of her vision as fever and complete exhaustion finally claimed their due. Strong arms caught her before she could strike the packed earth, lifting her with surprising gentleness for hands that had clearly seen hard labor. When consciousness returned, seconds or minutes later, impossible to tell, she found herself lying on rough wool blankets near a small fire pit. The Lakota man knelt beside her, adding split wood to flames that danced and crackled with blessed warmth against her skin. "You should put me outside," she whispered, because honesty seemed crucial in what might be her final conversation with another human being. "I'll bring trouble you don't need or want." What kind of trouble? The kind with federal badges and bounty money posted in 3 territories. The kind that pays better than whatever Agent Avery gives you for translation work. Wicasa went completely still, every muscle in his body tensing like a drawn bowstring. She knew about his work for the Indian agent, which meant she'd been watching the settlement longer than a few desperate minutes. Smart and careful, desperate enough to risk death for warmth, but aware enough to gather intelligence before making her move. How much trouble exactly? She struggled to sit up, failed, settled for meeting his eyes from the blankets. $50 in bounty money for anyone who brings me back breathing. Legal papers that say I'm bound property until my father's debts clear, which won't happen this side of perdition. Outside, the coyotes resumed their evening song closer, now emboldened by the scent of storm and human desperation. Something large scratched at the base of the door, testing the wood's strength with claws that could open a man's throat. "Stay down," Wicasa told her, moving to check the Spencer rifle's load with practiced efficiency. "Rest while you can manage it." "Why?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended, carrying all the confusion and fear of the past 2 months, compressed into a single word. "Why help someone who'll only cause you grief?" He looked at her for a long moment, firelight playing across features that spoke of strength earned through hardship and loss. Something in his expression reminded her of the men back home who'd fought in the recent war, not broken by what they'd seen, but changed by it in ways that went deeper than scars. "Because you're right about the salt," he said simply. "And because nobody should die alone in a storm." The words hit her harder than any grand speech about duty or Christian charity she'd heard from pulpits back in Kansas. No demands for gratitude, no lectures about proper behavior. Just basic human decency in a world that seemed determined to grind such things into dust. She closed her eyes, let exhaustion take her, trusting herself to a stranger's kindness because she had no other choice left. But as sleep claimed her, she thought she heard him moving around the preservation facility, checking his supplies and settling in for what promised to be a long night's vigil. Dawn brought the kind of visitors she'd been dreading since leaving Kansas. Wicasa stepped outside to find Dr. Owen Pike stamping snow from his boots, medical bag in hand, and worry lines etched deep around his eyes. Pike was a compact man in his 40s, steady-handed and soft-spoken, with the kind of reputation that made people trust him with their most dangerous secrets. "Heard you might need this," Pike said, holding up a brown bottle of laudanum. "Eliza Hart saw unusual tracks in the snow last night. Strange patterns like someone being chased. She sent me over with supplies and instructions to help however I can. Word travels fast in small places. Faster when it might involve someone who needs medical attention." Pike glanced toward the door, professional instincts already assessing whatever situation lay inside. "Is she conscious?" In the preservation facility, Millie sat propped against the wall, more alert than she'd been during the fever dreams of the previous night, but still pale as winter moonlight. Pike knelt beside her without ceremony, checking pulse and temperature with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd treated every kind of frontier ailment imaginable. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" "Tuesday, I think. Maybe Monday." She looked toward Wicasa, who was testing his salt mixtures with the careful attention she'd suggested. "That brine concentration needs fine-grained salt, not coarse. And the meat's hanging too close to the heat source for even curing." Pike raised an eyebrow as he cleaned the infected cut on her cheek with gentle precision. "She's giving preservation lessons while running a fever." "She knows the work," Wicasa confirmed. "Learned it keeping a farm kitchen from poisoning folks for 7 years. 7 years of making sure spoiled supplies didn't kill people." Millie added, wincing as Pike's needle bit into her skin. "You learn to taste trouble in the making when lives depend on getting it right." The doctor worked with methodical precision, his stitches small and neat, hands steady, despite whatever was troubling him. But Wicasa noticed something in Pike's manner, a tension that went beyond normal concern for a patient. The man knew more about their situation than he was letting on. "This will heal clean if you keep it dry," Pike said, applying the final bandage. "But there's something else we need to discuss urgently." He glanced toward Wicasa with an expression that carried bad news. "Ephraim Dunn rode in before sunrise. Says there were strangers asking pointed questions in town yesterday evening. Men with badges and official papers looking for a runaway girl with a scarred face and a substantial reward attached." The words settled over them like winter cold, seeping through cracks in the walls. Millie's hand went instinctively to the healing-cut fingers, tracing the mark that made her impossible to disguise or deny. "How long before they come here?" she asked. "Could be any time now. They're staying at Morrison's boarding house, working through every building in the settlement systematically. Won't take them long to reach this place." Wicasa checked his rifle, then moved to the single window and peered through a gap in the weathered boards. The street beyond lay empty under morning snow, but tracks crisscrossed the white surface like a map of everyone who'd been watching his preservation facility during the night. "What kind of men are we dealing with?" "Hard to say for certain. The leader's got a badge that looks official enough, but something about him doesn't sit right with folks. The others—" Pike shook his head grimly. "The others look like they enjoy their work considerably more than lawmen should." Before anyone could respond to that ominous assessment, hoofbeats drummed up to the building. Not just 3 riders this time, but what sounded like half a dozen men dismounting with the casual arrogance of people who expected immediate obedience. "Morning in there." The lead rider's voice carried the false cheer of a snake oil salesman mixed with undertones of genuine menace. "Name's Brock Fallon, Federal Recovery Agent. Got some official business to discuss with whoever's inside that building." Wicasa doused the lamp immediately and motioned for Millie to stay low behind the salt barrels. Through gaps in the weathered boards, they could see Fallon adjusting his expensive coat to display the pistol at his hip, a not-so-subtle reminder of the authority he claimed to wield. "You in there, Iron Fist." The use of his old warrior name made Wicasa's blood run cold in his veins. "Heard tell you might have something that belongs to me and my associates." Lakota. Few white men knew the name he'd earned hunting buffalo and scouting for cavalry units before the reservations. Fewer still would dare speak it aloud with such casual familiarity. These weren't simple bounty hunters looking for easy money. They were men who'd done extensive research into his background and connections. "Don't know what you're talking about." Wicasa called back, buying time while his mind raced through increasingly limited options. "Sure you do, Iron Fist. Young woman, brown hair-scarred face, pretty as a picture. Goes by Mildred Catherine, though I hear she's been using just Millie lately to avoid attention." Fallon's voice carried the satisfied tone of a card sharp holding a winning hand. "She's legally bound property according to territorial law, and I got papers from the federal government say I can reclaim her anywhere in Dakota." Wicasa felt Millie stiffen beside him in the shadows. Without thinking, he reached out and placed his palm against her back, not possessive but protective, steadying her against whatever was coming next in this confrontation. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description around here." Fallon's laugh held all the warmth of January wind, cutting across frozen prairie. "Now that's mighty curious, Iron Fist. See, Agent Avery mentioned you were asking some very specific questions about preservation techniques yesterday afternoon. Salt ratios, meat storage methods, all the particular knowledge our runaway girl's supposed to have picked up, keeping house for her daddy back in Kansas." The second piece of devastating news hit like a fist to the solar plexus. If Silas Avery was actively involved in this manhunt, then Wicasa's position as translator was worse than merely compromised. The Indian agent controlled the flow of government rations to the reservation, and he could cut off supplies to punish anyone who crossed his interests or interfered with his private business arrangements. "Maybe I just want my winter stores to last until spring planting." Wicasa replied, still buying precious time while trying to formulate some kind of survival plan. "Maybe so. Or maybe you're harboring stolen property in direct violation of federal law." Fallon's voice moved closer to the door boots, crunching through snow. "Either way, I got legal authority to search any building in this settlement. Federal business takes precedence over local concerns and territorial boundaries." A heavy boot crashed through one of the loose boards near the floor, sending splinters flying across the packed earth. Millie jerked backward, and Wicasa grabbed the iron hook he used for moving heavy salt barrels. When the boot appeared again, trying to widen the breach, he drove the hook deep into leather and bone, then twisted with all his considerable strength. The man outside shrieked like a wounded animal and tumbled backward into the snow, cursing in language that would make a cavalry sergeant cover his ears. Wicasa cocked the Spencer and thrust the barrel through the hole where the boot had been. "Next man puts anything through my wall gets it shot clean off," he announced with cold precision. "Now you're threatening federal officers in the lawful performance of their duties." Fallon snarled, though his voice had moved considerably farther from the vulnerable door. "I'm defending my property against armed trespassers. Territorial law's crystal clear on that particular subject." What followed was a tense standoff that stretched for nearly an hour. Fallon's men tested the building's defenses systematically, trying to pry loose boards, attempting to climb onto the roof, even building small fires against the walls to see if smoke would force the occupants outside. But Wicasa had chosen his defensive position well. The preservation facility had been built to withstand prairie storms and curious wildlife, with thick walls and limited access points that could be covered by a single rifleman. Inside, Pike worked quietly in the shadows, preparing medical supplies for whatever injuries might come, while Millie sorted through Wicasa's equipment with the focused attention of someone evaluating tactical resources. Her hands moved with professional competence, despite the danger-checking salt levels and preservation tools, as if cataloging potential weapons. "They're planning something bigger," she whispered during a lull in the probing attacks. "This isn't just about capturing me anymore. They're taking too many risks, making too much noise. Someone in town will report this to proper authorities." She was right, Wicasa realized. Fallon's behavior had escalated beyond simple bounty hunting into something that resembled a military assault on a building in the middle of a settled community. Either the man was completely confident in his legal authority, or he was desperate enough to risk everything on this one operation. Maybe that's what they want, Pike said grimly from his position near the medical supplies. "Draw attention, force a confrontation with local law enforcement. Could be they've got backing we don't know about." Before anyone could respond to that disturbing possibility, Fallon's voice cut through the winter air with renewed authority and barely controlled rage. "Listen up in there. My patience is officially exhausted, and my legal options are running thin. You got exactly 5 minutes to send out the girl, or we start this place burning board by board until you got no choice but to come out choking on smoke." True to his word, within minutes they could smell coal oil and burning kindling. Yellow light began dancing against the windows as Fallon's men positioned fires around the building's perimeter, close enough to catch the weathered wood, but far enough away to avoid immediate retaliation. "Can't let them burn the facility." Wicasa said more to himself than to his companions. Without his preserved meat, several families would face genuine starvation before spring crops could be harvested. The mathematics of frontier survival were brutal but unavoidable. "Then we go out fighting?" Millie asked, her voice steady despite their deteriorating situation. "We go out smart." He led them to the corner where he stored empty barrels and old equipment using the iron hook to pry up several loose floorboards with practiced efficiency. Beneath lay the root cellar he'd excavated when first building the place. Nothing elaborate, just a storage space that connected to the old copper mine drainage system running under half the settlement like veins in a leaf. "Where do those tunnels lead?" Millie asked, peering down into absolute darkness that seemed to swallow their whispered words. "Dr. Pike's house, if we're lucky, and the passages haven't collapsed over the years. Maybe the schoolhouse foundation or the church basement. Hard to say for certain without better maps." The smoke was growing thicker by the minute, and they could hear flames beginning to crackle against the exterior walls. Soon the temperature would rise enough to spoil his carefully preserved meat stores, and the smoke itself would make breathing impossible for anyone trapped inside. "I'll go first to test the route," Wikasa decided. "Count to 30, then follow single file. If shooting starts up here, you keep moving forward no matter what happens." Millie grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her fingers finding his wrist in the dim light. What if they're waiting in the tunnels? What if this is exactly what they expected us to do? Then we die underground instead of up here roasting like Sunday dinner. I'd call those considerably better odds given the circumstances. He dropped through the opening into cold, musty air that tasted of minerals and decades-old earth. The cellar was barely 4 feet high, forcing him to move in an awkward crouch that put strain on his back and legs immediately. Water dripped somewhere in the absolute darkness ahead, and the silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat echoing off stone walls. Above him, Pike's boots appeared through the opening, first, followed by Millie lowering herself with careful precision to avoid aggravating her injuries. They landed beside him in the cramped space with barely a whisper of displaced air. Which direction gives us the best chance?" Pike asked in a voice so quiet it barely qualified as sound. Wikasa oriented himself by the subtle slope of the floor and the distant sound of flowing water. Mine tunnels invariably followed natural drainage patterns toward the creek, which meant east toward the center of town and hopefully toward people who might offer assistance rather than opposition. They began crawling through passages carved from living rock by men who'd been dead for years, following traces of air current and the sound of moving water somewhere ahead in the darkness. Behind them, increasingly urgent shouts suggested that Fallon had discovered their escape route and was organizing pursuit through the tunnel system. The main passage split into 3 branches after what felt like miles, but was probably only a few hundred yards of painful progress through cramped stone corridors. Wikasa chose the middle tunnel by pure instinct, following what seemed like the primary drainage channel based on airflow and the sound of water. They moved in single file through absolute darkness, Millie staying close behind Wikasa while Pike brought up the rear. Every few yards, Wikasa would pause to listen for sounds of pursuit, and during these moments, Millie's hand would find his shoulder or arm, not clinging, but maintaining contact for reassurance and navigation in the suffocating blackness. The tunnel began to slope upward after an eternity of horizontal crawling, and eventually they reached a vertical shaft with iron rungs set into the stone wall. Pale morning light filtered down from above, along with the blessed sound of familiar voices engaged in urgent conversation. Miwar heard sustained gunfire from the direction of the preservation facility. "Need to send someone for the sheriff, but he won't be back from Deadwood until Thursday at the earliest." Those strangers had official-looking badges, but something about them didn't sit right with most folks. Wikasa climbed the shaft, first his shoulders and arms, screaming from the cramped journey through narrow passages. He emerged into Dr. Pike's cellar, a neat space lined with shelves of medical supplies and preserved foods that spoke of careful preparation and professional competence. Pike himself stood at the top of the cellar stairs with rifle in hand, peering out his kitchen window at the orange glow visible in the direction of the preservation facility. When he heard movement behind him, he turned with weapon ready, then relaxed when he recognized the familiar faces. "About time you showed up," Pike said grimly. "Figured you might try this route if things got desperate enough." Millie climbed up behind Wikasa's stone dust and cobwebs, decorating her dark hair like premature snow. Pike took one look at her condition and shook his head with something that might have been admiration, mixed with professional concern. "Miss, you've managed to cause more excitement in 3 days than this settlement has seen in 3 years of normal operation." "Is the building burning?" she asked, looking toward the window where firelight painted the morning sky with ominous colors. Not the structure itself yet, but they've got kindling piled against every wall, and that Fallon character is making increasingly loud speeches about federal authority and legal backing. Pike checked his rifle's load with movements that spoke of military experience. Half the town's turned out to watch the spectacle, which is probably the only thing keeping this situation from escalating into outright warfare. Through the kitchen window, Wicasa could see the crowd that had gathered in the snow-covered street, men, women, and children drawn by the promise of violence, or simply grateful for any break in winter's tedious routine. Among the faces, he recognized potential allies and definite enemies, people who might help and others who'd sell them for the price of a good meal. But there was something else in Pike's manner that troubled him, a tension that went beyond normal concern for neighbors in danger. The doctors seemed to know more about their situation than simple proximity should explain. Public opinion might work in our favor, Wicasa said, carefully testing the waters. Might. Or folks might decide $50 in bounty money is worth more than abstract principles about right and wrong. Pike moved away from the window with obvious reluctance. Depends on who speaks up first and how convincing they manage to sound. Before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the morning air, outside loud official, and carrying an edge of barely contained governmental fury. Brock Fallon, what in the name of all that's holy do you think you're doing out here? Marshal Tom Bradley had arrived from Deadwood a full day ahead of his expected schedule, and he was clearly not pleased with what he discovered in Crow's Landing. The federal marshal was a compact man with silver hair and a reputation for cutting through legal complications like a sharp blade through warm butter. He stood in the street with his hands planted firmly on his hips, glaring at the flames that were beginning to lick hungrily at the preservation facility's weathered walls. I asked you a direct question, Fallon. Bradley continued, his voice carrying clearly through the winter air. You've got exactly 10 seconds to explain why you're conducting what appears to be an armed assault on civilian property without proper warrants or legal authorization. Through Pike's kitchen window, they watched Fallon straighten his expensive coat and assume what he probably thought was an appropriately official manner. The bounty hunter's badge caught the firelight as he stepped forward to address the federal marshal with obvious confidence. Marshal Bradley, I'm executing a duly authorized federal recovery order for stolen property. The suspects barricaded themselves inside that building and refused lawful surrender when presented with proper documentation. What suspects are we talking about specifically? The Indian translator and the runaway girl. We have complete legal documentation authorizing recovery. Let me see those papers immediately. Fallon produced an expensive leather portfolio and extracted several official-looking documents with obvious pride. Bradley examined them by the dancing light of the fires, his expression growing progressively darker and more skeptical with each page he read. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama and eager to witness whatever confrontation was about to unfold. These aren't federal papers, Bradley announced after several tense minutes of careful examination. They're territorial contracts. Half of them appear to have been signed sometime very recently. Where exactly did you acquire these documents? Indian Agent Avery provided all proper documentation through established government channels. Silas Avery. Bradley's voice cracked like a whip across the settlement, causing several people in the crowd to step backward instinctively. That thieving snake has been systematically skimming government rations for the past 2 years. You're taking his word on legal matters. In Pike's cellar, Millie set down her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly from more than cold. He's actually challenging the documentation. That's encouraging, Wicasa replied, though he understood it wasn't nearly that simple. Even if Bradley exposed Fallon's papers as fraudulent, Avery still controlled the flow of supplies to the reservation and could make life hellish for anyone who crossed his business interests. Furthermore, Mr. Fallon. Bradley was continuing outside, his voice gaining strength and official authority. Your bounty hunter's license expired last September, according to territorial records. You currently possess no more legal authority than any other private citizen, which means you've been impersonating a federal officer in the performance of these activities. The crowd murmured with obvious appreciation and growing confidence. Nothing pleased frontier folks quite like watching self-important men get taken down several pegs by proper governmental authority. But Fallon clearly wasn't prepared to surrender his position without a significant fight. The girl remains legally bound property regardless of paperwork irregularities, he said stubbornly, his voice taking on a harder edge. The original debt contract is valid under territorial law, and I retain the legal right to reclaim her for transport back to Kansas. Legally bound property. A new voice cut through the morning air like a finely honed blade, Eliza Hart pushing her way through the crowd, with schoolteacher posture radiating moral indignation that could be felt from 50 yards away. Marshal Bradley, are we seriously discussing human beings as property in 1877 under territorial law? Now, Miss Hart, Bradley began diplomatically. Don't you now Miss Hart me, Tom Bradley. You know perfectly well that debt bondage is barely legal, even when it's conducted according to proper procedures, and this entire business smells considerably worse than week-old fish left rotting in the sun. The crowd was shifting now, Wicasa noticed with growing hope. What had begun as simple entertainment was evolving into something more serious and potentially more dangerous, a fundamental question about community values and what kind of place Crow's Landing wanted to be. He could see neighbors looking at each other, making private calculations about right and wrong profit, and principle the kind of community they wanted their children to inherit. Dr. Pike cleared his throat diplomatically from his position by the kitchen window. Marshal, if I might contribute something to this discussion based on my professional observations. But instead of heading outside immediately, Pike turned to face Wicasa and Millie with an expression that carried the weight of long-delayed confession. There's something I need to tell you both before this goes any further. He said, his voice heavy with guilt that had clearly been eating at him for months. Something about my own involvement in this business that you have a right to know. Wicasa felt his stomach drop as he recognized the tone, the particular quality of voice that meant terrible revelations were about to reshape everything he thought he understood about their situation. 3 years ago, I was approached by a man claiming to represent Territorial Health Services. Pike continued the words coming out in a rush, as if he needed to speak them before losing his nerve completely. He said they needed medical evaluations of young women entering domestic service contracts, routine examinations to verify health fitness for various types of work, general medical clearance for employment purposes. The implications were slowly sinking in around the kitchen table. Millie's hand went instinctively to her mouth, and something cold began forming in Wicasa's chest. The compensation he offered was quite generous for what seemed like straightforward medical procedures. Pike continued. Simple examinations, basic health assessments, documentation that employers could use to verify they were hiring capable workers. It all seemed completely legitimate at the time. How many young women are we talking about? Wicasa asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Pike step backward involuntarily. 15 that I can remember clearly. Maybe as many as 20 over the course of 2 years. Pike's shoulders sagged under the weight of his admission. All of them appeared healthy and capable. All of them seemed genuinely eager for legitimate work opportunities. I had no idea what was really happening to them after they left my office. You were certifying girls for sale into bondage. Millie said, her voice hollow with understanding and barely controlled rage. You were part of the system from the beginning. I thought they were legitimate employment contracts. Pike's voice cracked with desperation and self-recrimination. Domestic service positions, shop work, agricultural labor on established farms. The medical evaluations seemed entirely reasonable. Any responsible employer would naturally want to verify that potential workers were healthy enough to perform their assigned duties effectively. The kitchen fell into the kind of silence that precedes either violence or forgiveness, with no clear indication of which direction things might go. Wicasa felt fury building in his chest, not just at Avery and Fallon, but at this man who'd been helping them while carrying such enormous guilt and maintaining such a careful facade of respectability. "That's why you've been so eager to help us," Millie said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone stating obvious facts. "You're trying to buy forgiveness for what you did. I've been working to destroy this network ever since I learned the truth about it 6 months ago," Pike replied, cooperating with Peters, gathering evidence, waiting for the right opportunity to act decisively. "When Wicasa brought you here that night, I saw our chance to finally accomplish something meaningful. Outside, the confrontation between Bradley and Fallon was reaching a critical point, but inside Pike's kitchen, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. Wicasa found himself looking at the doctor with entirely new eyes, trying to reconcile the man who'd helped save their lives with the man who'd unknowingly helped destroy so many others. "How did you find out?" he asked finally. "Peters brought me some of Avery's internal correspondence that he'd managed to copy," Pike said. "Letters discussing merchandise quality and transport arrangements and customer satisfaction in ways that made it clear these women weren't being sent to legitimate employment. When I realized what I'd actually been participating in..." He trailed off, but the implication was clear enough. Pike had discovered that his medical certifications were being used to guarantee the health and fitness of women being sold into prostitution, forced labor, or worse fates in remote mining camps and frontier settlements. Before anyone could respond to this revelation, sharp knocking came at the front door, not quite aggressive, but carrying an unmistakable note of official authority that demanded immediate attention. Pike moved to the window and peered out cautiously, his face going pale as he recognized whoever stood on his front porch. "It's another federal marshal. Claims to be Marshal Davidson from the territorial capital. But something doesn't feel right about him." As Pike opened the door to admit the newcomer, Wicasa noticed several details that made his combat instincts scream warnings. The man's badge looked authentic enough, and he spoke with proper official authority, but his boots were too clean and new for someone who'd supposedly ridden hard from the territorial capital through winter conditions. More importantly, when he removed his hat, there was a distinct pale line across his forehead, where a different style of hat had been worn recently and frequently. "Marshal Davidson," the newcomer announced, stepping into the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone completely certain of his welcome. "I received Marshal Bradley's urgent message about trouble with illegal debt recovery operations in this area." Bradley was still outside dealing with Fallon's increasingly aggressive behavior, which meant this supposed federal marshal had arrived independently and with suspicious timing. Wicasa caught Millie's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the back door, hoping she understood that something was fundamentally wrong about this entire situation. "Certainly glad you could make it out here so quickly, Marshal Wheats," Pike said, moving to clear space on the kitchen table. "We've managed to uncover evidence of what appears to be a major criminal conspiracy involving multiple territories." "Yes, I've heard some preliminary reports about the situation. Very disturbing developments indeed." The false marshal's eyes weren't focused on any evidence spread across the table. They were tracking Millie's position in the room with predatory precision, calculating distances and angles, like a hunter sizing up prey. "Would you mind if I examined those documents personally to assess their legal validity?" As Pike began organizing papers for inspection, Wicasa noticed that the newcomer's coat was buttoned incorrectly, and when the man reached toward the documents with his left hand, he caught a glimpse of fresh rope burns around the wrist, the kind of marks left by someone who'd been tied up recently and had struggled against restraints. "Actually," Wicasa said with deliberate casualness, "before we proceed with any official business, could you show us your authorization papers and identification? Just for our records, you understand. The false marshal's hand paused in mid-reach toward the evidence, and for just a moment, his carefully maintained facade slipped enough to reveal something cold and dangerous underneath. Of course, they're in my saddlebags outside with my horse. I'll just step out and retrieve them. That's when he made his move for the gun concealed under his coat. Wakasa was already in motion, throwing himself across the kitchen table as the imposter's weapon cleared its leather holster. The gunshot went wild, punching a hole through Pike's ceiling and showering them all with plaster fragments as they crashed together into the kitchen wall. Behind them, Millie screamed, and Pike cursed loudly, his own rifle coming up to track the violent struggle. But the fake marshal was considerably stronger and more skilled than he'd initially appeared, almost certainly one of Fallon's men in disguise, trained specifically for this kind of close-quarters combat situation. He drove a knee hard into Wakasa's ribs, broke free from the initial grapple with professional efficiency, and swung his weapon toward Millie with deadly intent and practiced precision. Pike's rifle boomed from across the kitchen, the heavy slug taking the imposter in the shoulder and spinning him around violently. But the wound didn't drop him. As expected, he staggered but remained dangerously upright, gun still tracking toward its intended target with grim determination. That's when Millie surprised everyone in the room by refusing to behave like a helpless victim. Instead of diving for cover like any sensible person would do, she grabbed the heaviest ledger from the kitchen table and hurled it straight at the gunman's head with remarkable accuracy, born of desperation and years of hard physical work. The thick book caught him squarely in the face, blood exploding from his nose as he stumbled backward into Pike's medical cabinet with enough force to rattle bottles and instruments. Wakasa followed up immediately, with his fist putting everything he had behind the punch and connecting solidly with the man's temple. The false marshal's head snapped back, violently struck the cabinet's solid oak construction with a sound like splitting wood, and he slid down the wall into unconsciousness, with blood streaming from multiple facial wounds. In the sudden ringing silence that followed the violence, and they could all hear authentic hoofbeats approaching rapidly from multiple directions, and the sound of many riders converging on Pike's house from different parts of the settlement. "Those will be the real federal marshals," Pike said grimly, checking the unconscious man's pockets for identification while trying to stop the bleeding from his shoulder wound. "I sent a priority message to the territorial capital yesterday about our situation here." But Wakasa was already moving toward the front window with his Spencer rifle ready, because trust had become a luxury they simply couldn't afford after being fooled once by professional deception. What he saw outside made him smile genuinely for the first time in several days. Marshal Davidson, the real one this time, recognizable from previous encounters, rode at the head of more than a dozen authentic federal deputies, all wearing badges that showed proper wear and weathering from actual field work. Behind them came a second group of riders that made Wakasa's heart lift, with Hope, his cousin Chaska, leading several young Lakota men from the reservation, all armed and clearly ready for whatever might come next. But there was something different about Chaska's expression as he dismounted, a mixture of shame and determination that suggested the young man had confessions of his own to make before this situation could be properly resolved. Outside, Marshal Bradley had finally lost patience with Fallon's increasingly erratic behavior. "That's enough." His voice carried clearly through the winter air. "Mr. Fallon, you're under arrest for impersonation of a federal officer, assault on civilian property, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping under territorial law." What followed was the kind of gunfight that frontier towns remembered for decades. Fallon's response to the arrest warrant was to draw his weapon and start shooting not at Bradley specifically, but into the crowd of civilians who'd gathered to watch the confrontation. People scattered like startled birds, diving behind wagons and water troughs, while women grabbed children and ran for the safety of nearby buildings. From Pike's kitchen window, they could see muzzle flashes lighting up the early morning dimness as federal marshals returned fire with disciplined precision. But Fallon had chosen his position well, using the burning preservation facility as cover, while his remaining men spread out to create overlapping fields of fire. "We need to help them," Wicasa said, checking his rifle's load. "We need to stay alive," Pike replied, applying pressure to his wounded shoulder while keeping watch on their unconscious prisoner. "Bradley's got enough men to handle Fallon if they can avoid civilian casualties." But Millie was studying the tactical situation with the sharp attention of someone who'd learned to evaluate dangerous situations quickly and accurately. "Fallon's not trying to escape," she said. "He's trying to burn evidence. Look, he's got men with torches moving toward other buildings." She was right. While the main gunfight continued in the street, several of Fallon's associates were attempting to set fire to the general store, the boarding house, and other structures that might contain records or witnesses related to the debt bondage network. This wasn't just a desperate last stand, it was a systematic attempt to destroy everything that could be used as evidence against the larger criminal conspiracy. "They're going to burn the whole settlement," Pike said with growing alarm. "We have to stop them." That's when Chaska appeared at the kitchen's back door, moving with the careful stealth that Wicasa remembered from their childhood hunting expeditions. But instead of the confident young warrior, Wicasa expected his cousin's face was marked by deep shame and obvious internal conflict. "Cousin," Chaska said quietly, "I need to tell you something before we go any further. Something I should have admitted weeks ago." Wicasa studied his cousin's expression, seeing guilt and fear and something that might have been relief at finally unburdening himself of a terrible secret that had been eating at him from the inside. "What is it?" "I've been working for Avery," Chaska said in a rush, the words tumbling out before he could lose his nerve. "Not willingly at first, he threatened to cut off rations to my mother and sisters if I didn't cooperate with his requests. But then he started paying me real money, more than I'd ever seen, and I told myself I was just translating a few extra documents, nothing that would actually hurt anyone." The confession hit Wicasa like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm and focused. Family was family, and young men made mistakes when their loved ones were threatened with starvation. "How long?" he asked simply. 6 months, maybe longer. He had me watching people reporting on conversations, identifying families that might be vulnerable to recruitment for his contracts. Chaska's voice was getting steadier now that the worst part was out in the open. "But I swear to you, cousin, I didn't understand what those contracts really meant until 3 weeks ago." "What happened 3 weeks ago?" "I saw my sister." The words hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Wicasa felt his blood turn to ice water as the implications sank in completely. Winona was supposed to be working at a trading post in Nebraska territory. Chaska continued, his voice breaking with barely controlled emotion. "Good wages, respectable work, a chance to send money home to help support the family through the winter. But I saw her in a transport wagon with 6 other girls, all chained together like animals being moved toward the mining camps in the Black Hills." Now Wicasa understood the shame and desperate determination in his cousin's expression. Chaska had discovered that his own sister was a victim of the very network he'd been helping to support through his intelligence gathering. "That's when I realized what I'd really been doing all those months," Chaska said. "That's when I started working secretly with Peters to gather evidence against Avery and his associates. And that's when I sent word to Winona that help was coming if she could just survive long enough. Where is she now? Free. Peters and I managed to get her out 2 nights ago, along with 4 other girls from the same transport wagon. They're hidden in the old mine workings east of town until this situation gets completely resolved." Relief flooded through Wicasa, followed immediately by a new understanding of why Chaska had turned against his former employer with such fierce determination. Nothing motivated a man quite like discovering that his own family had been threatened and violated. Outside, the gunfight was intensifying as more of Fallon's men emerged from concealment around the settlement. These weren't just bounty hunters looking for easy money. They were professional fighters with military training and coordinated tactics, suggesting that the debt bondage network had resources and backing that went far beyond simple territorial corruption. "We'll settle personal accounts later," Wicasa decided. "Right now, we need to stop them from burning down half the town and destroying evidence that could save dozens of other people." The plan they developed was necessarily simple, but extremely dangerous. While Bradley's federal marshals kept Fallon's main force pinned down in the street, Wicasa and Chaska would approach the Indian Agency office through the tunnel system to prevent Avery from destroying crucial records. Millie insisted on accompanying them, despite the obvious risks, arguing that the files might be in code or cipher that would require her experience with her father's record-keeping methods to interpret correctly. Pike would remain behind to guard their prisoner and provide medical assistance to anyone injured in the fighting, though his wounded shoulder limited his effectiveness significantly. They entered through the same abandoned mine shaft they'd used earlier, crawling through narrow stone passages that seemed even more cramped and claustrophobic than Wicasa remembered from their previous escape. Behind them, the sounds of sustained gunfire echoed through the tunnel system like distant thunder, suggesting that the battle above ground was far from over. The passage leading specifically to the Indian Agency building was older and more deteriorated than the others, barely wide enough for a single person, and requiring them to move in single file through absolute darkness that seemed to swallow sound and hope equally. Wicasa led the way, feeling along rough stone walls for the vertical shaft that should provide access to the building's foundation. During the long crawl through cramped passages, Millie's hand would occasionally find his ankle or boot, maintaining contact for navigation and reassurance in the suffocating blackness. Each brief touch sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with body heat and everything to do with the growing connection between them that seemed to strengthen under pressure. When they finally reached the access point, faint light filtered down from above, along with the sound of Avery moving around, frantically, clearly destroying documents as fast as his hands could manage the work. Time was rapidly running out for any chance of preserving evidence that could be used to locate and free dozens of victims scattered across multiple territories. Wicasa climbed the vertical shaft, first his shoulders and arms, burning from the extended journey through narrow tunnels. He emerged into a stone-walled basement filled with government supplies and official records that represented years of systematic corruption and abuse of federal authority. Above them, heavy boots paced back and forth across wooden floors, while Avery shouted curses at invisible enemies, and the sound of papers being fed to flames grew increasingly urgent. They could definitely smell smoke now. Not just from the fires outside, but from documents being systematically destroyed in the offices above their heads. Millie climbed up behind Wicasa with determined grace, followed closely by Chaska, whose expression had hardened into something that spoke of personal vengeance mixed with broader justice. In the dim light filtering down from the main floor, they could see stairs leading upward and the unmistakable glow of flames coming from somewhere in the building's interior. "The main files will be in his private office," Millie whispered urgently. "We need to move fast before he destroys everything that could be used to track down victims and prosecute the network." They crept up the stairs with Wicasa leading Spencer rifle ready for immediate use at the first sign of resistance. At the top, a door opened onto a hallway lined with government notices and territorial maps that provided a facade of legitimate administrative function over what was actually a criminal enterprise. The smoke was definitely growing thicker, coming from Avery's office at the far end of the corridor, where orange light danced against the walls like something from a fever dream. But as they moved down the hallway, Wicasa noticed something that made his combat instincts scream warnings, fresh scratches on the floor, as if heavy furniture had been moved recently to create barriers or cover. The first room they checked contained ledgers and correspondence representing the legitimate aspects of government business. But Millie immediately began stuffing the most important-looking documents into a canvas bag, while Wakesa and Chaska moved toward the source of the smoke and dancing firelight. What they found in Avery's office was worse than simple document destruction. It was a carefully prepared battlefield. The corrupt Indian agent had barricaded himself behind an overturned desk, using the heavy oak furniture as cover, while methodically feeding papers into a large metal wastebasket that served as an improvised furnace. But he wasn't alone, and he wasn't panicking. A lean, scarred man in buckskin, clearly a professional gunfighter, crouched by the window, with a rifle periodically firing at targets outside while maintaining disciplined watch over the office's approaches. More importantly, both men had clearly been expecting company. "Welcome to my office, Iron Fist," Avery said calmly, not bothering to look up from his document destruction. "Took you longer than I expected to work through the tunnel system." The scarred gunman's rifle swung toward the doorway with practiced precision, but Chaska was already moving, diving to one side, while bringing his own weapon to bear. The office erupted in gunfire and smoke as all three men opened fire simultaneously in the confined space. Wakesa rolled behind a filing cabinet as bullets chewed through wood and plaster around him, splinters flying like deadly rain. The scarred gunman was good, very good, but he was caught between multiple targets in a room that offered limited cover and no escape route. Chaska's shot took the man in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him behind Avery's makeshift barricade with a wet final sound. But Avery himself was far from finished, and the Indian agent proved to be considerably more dangerous than his administrative position suggested. "You destroyed everything, Iron Fist," Avery snarled, rising from behind his overturned desk with a pistol in each hand. 10 years of careful work, 10 years of building something profitable and sustainable, and you ruined it all for some runaway girl who should have stayed home and married the man her father picked. Both weapons fired simultaneously, but Wakesa was already moving, using his superior knowledge of the building's layout to circle around toward Avery's flank. One bullet splintered the doorframe inches from his head, while the other punched through the wall where he'd been standing moments before. That's when Millie appeared in the doorway behind them, took in the tactical situation instantly, and made a decision that probably saved both their lives. Instead of taking cover like any sensible person would do, she grabbed the heavy water pitcher from Avery's washstand and hurled it with deadly accuracy at the burning wastebasket. Water exploded across burning documents and hot metal, creating a cloud of steam and smoke that filled the office and temporarily blinded everyone inside. In the confusion, Wakesa closed the distance to Avery's position and drove the Spencer's wooden stock into the corrupt official's solar plexus with all his strength. Avery folded in half and dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. But even wounded and winded, he managed to grab a handful of burning papers from the scattered contents of the wastebasket. With his last bit of coherent effort, he pressed the flames against a stack of ledgers on the floor beside his desk. "If I can't keep my network running," he wheezed through damaged lungs, "then nobody gets to use the evidence against me or my associates." Flames spread rapidly through dry paper and old wood, reaching hungrily toward additional document stacks around the office. Within moments, half the room was ablaze, and fire was threatening to consume years of carefully maintained records that represented the only hope of locating and freeing dozens of victims. Millie rushed into the burning office without regard for her own safety, grabbing whatever document she could reach while beating at flames with her bare hands and pieces of torn clothing. Wakesa and Chaska joined her immediately, stamping out fires and salvaging whatever evidence they could save from the spreading conflagration. Most of the crucial ledgers were rescued, along with correspondence that would prove the network's extent across multiple territories and provide the detailed information necessary to track down victims and arrest perpetrators. But the cost was high. All three of them sustained burns on their hands and arms, and the smoke inhalation left them coughing and gasping for clean air. By the time authentic federal marshals broke down the front door of the Indian Agency building, the fire was extinguished and Avery was securely restrained. The evidence was smoke-damaged and partially burned, but entirely readable. Where it mattered most: names, dates, monetary amounts, and destination records that would enable law enforcement agencies to systematically dismantle the entire criminal conspiracy. "How many victims are we looking at?" Marshal Bradley asked, examining the rescued documents by lamplight while medical personnel treated their injuries. "At least 60 families confirmed in these immediate records." Millie replied, her voice hollow with the scope of the tragedy they'd uncovered. Children sold into labor camps, women transported to mining towns, and brothels, some of the victims as young as 12 years old, according to these medical certificates. The numbers were staggering, but so was the hope these records represented. With evidence this comprehensive and detailed, federal authorities could systematically track down victims, prosecute perpetrators, and hopefully rescue at least some of the people who'd been sold into various forms of bondage. Outside, the last of Fallon's men had been captured or killed, and the fires that had threatened to consume half the settlement were finally under control. The immediate crisis was over, but the emotional and legal aftermath would continue for months as the full scope of the criminal network became clear. That evening, as they sat in Pike's kitchen, having their burns treated and giving statements to federal investigators, Wicasa found himself looking at Millie with entirely new understanding. Throughout everything, the desperate flight from Kansas, the confrontations with bounty hunters, the evidence gathering, and the fighting, she'd consistently demonstrated courage and intelligence that humbled him completely. But it was more than just admiration for her competence under pressure. Somewhere between the moment she'd corrected his salt ratios while running a fever and the moment she'd risked her life to save burning evidence that could free other victims, she'd become precious to him in ways that went far beyond gratitude or partnership. During a quiet moment while Pike was treating Chaska's injuries in the next room, Millie moved closer to where Wicasa sat, having his burned hands bandaged. The simple act of her choosing to sit beside him rather than across the room sent warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with their proximity to the fire. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly, her voice carrying a vulnerability he hadn't heard before. "Something I've been feeling but wasn't sure how to express properly without making things complicated." Wicasa set down his coffee cup and gave her his complete attention, sensing that this moment carried more significance than any legal document or government investigation they'd yet encountered. "I care about you." She continued the words, coming out in a careful rush, as if she needed to speak them before losing her courage. "Not just as someone who helped save my life when I needed it most, not just as a partner in the work we've been doing together. I care about you as a man, as someone I want to build a future with, as someone I—" She paused, searching for exactly the right words. "As someone I love." The confession hung in the air between them like something sacred and fragile. Wicasa felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he looked into her eyes and saw everything he'd been hoping to find. They reflected back at him. "I love you too," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended, but carrying all the weight of absolute truth. "Have loved you since that first night, when you stumbled into my preservation facility half dead, but still determined to correct my technique. Maybe even before that, from the moment you looked at me without flinching despite everything you'd been through." She moved closer, then close enough that he could see firelight dancing in her eyes, close enough to catch the scent of prairie wind and determination that always seemed to cling to her hair. When she reached up to touch the side of his face with gentle fingers, he leaned into the contact like a man finding water after days in the desert. Their first kiss was everything he'd imagined, and nothing like he'd expected simultaneously. Soft and fierce, tentative and certain, carrying all the weight of shared survival and the promise of whatever came next in their lives. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Millie's eyes were bright with unshed tears that spoke of relief and hope rather than sadness. 6 months later, autumn had transformed the Dakota Territory prairie from summer's golden abundance into a magnificent tapestry of red and orange that stretched endlessly toward every horizon. The settlement of Crow's Landing showed clear signs of healing and growth. New buildings rising where others had burned fresh paint, brightening old structures, and the general bustle of a community that had discovered its own strength and moral character through adversity. The trials had been swift, thorough, and satisfying. Fallon had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison while Avery died during the final confrontation at the Indian Agency building. More importantly, 43 victims had been successfully located and freed through the evidence they'd risked their lives to preserve, returned to their families, or helped to establish new lives as free citizens with government support. It wasn't everyone who'd been taken by the network, but it was enough to prove that standing up against organized evil could make a meaningful difference in the world. Wicasa's new preservation facility stood where the old one had been, but considerably larger and better constructed thanks to territorial government compensation for his role in exposing the criminal conspiracy. But the building served purposes beyond food preservation now. Most mornings found it filled with children learning to read and write their voices, mixing with the salt, sweet air in a combination that felt exactly right for building the future. "Remember," Millie was saying to a group of eager students, "the letter P makes the same sound whether it begins the word preservation or ends the word soup. Can anyone think of another word that starts with that same sound?" Little Mary Bridger's hand shot up enthusiastically. "Pie." "Excellent choice. And what kind of pie is your personal favorite?" "Apple pie, like the one you made for the harvest celebration last month." Wicasa smiled from his position, checking brine concentrations, using the precise methods Millie had taught him during those first dangerous days that seemed like a lifetime ago. The harvest celebration had become the settlement's way of marking not just autumn crops, but the sense of genuine community they'd built together through shared adversity and common purpose. The pie had been perfect naturally. Millie's scientific precision combined with apples from Ephraim Dunn's recovered orchard sugar, purchased with restitution money from the territorial government, and techniques that honored both their cultural traditions while creating something entirely new and better. After the children left for the day, Millie approached where he worked with the preservation equipment, her movements carrying the confidence of someone who'd found her proper place in the world and intended to defend it against all challenges. "How do the salt levels look today?" She asked the same question she'd been asking for months, but which never got old or routine. "Perfect as always. Your measurements never failed to produce exactly the results we need." "Good. Mrs. Patterson wants to learn the technique for her boarding house kitchen, and Dr. Pike mentioned that territorial health inspectors will be visiting next month to certify our methods for wider distribution." Pike had faced no criminal charges for his unwitting participation in the medical examinations that had facilitated the debt bondage network. His cooperation with the investigation and obvious genuine remorse had convinced federal authorities that his involvement was purely accidental. But he'd thrown himself completely into making amends, treating former victims without charge, and working tirelessly to establish better medical standards throughout the territory. It had become their comfortable routine, Wicasa handling the physical aspects of preservation work, while Millie managed the precise chemistry and measurements that made everything possible. Partnership born of desperate necessity had evolved into something much deeper and more complex, rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose that went far beyond mere survival. A knock at the door interrupted these pleasant thoughts. Marshal Bradley entered carrying an official envelope sealed with territorial government wax, his expression suggesting a mixture of good news and potentially complicated developments. "This arrived on today's stage," he said, offering the envelope to Millie. From Topeka, addressed specifically to you with official government markings. Millie's face went pale as she recognized the return address, but her hands remained steady as she broke the wax seal and unfolded several sheets of legal documents covered in careful lawyer's handwriting that spoke of significant official business. As she read through the papers carefully, her expression shifted gradually from apprehension to surprise, to something approaching genuine wonder and disbelief. "What does it say?" Wicasa asked, gently, moving closer to offer whatever support might be needed regardless of the news. "My father died 6 weeks ago," she said, looking up at him with eyes that were bright, but not with tears of grief. "Consumption finally took him, just like I expected it would eventually. But before he died, he apparently signed a complete confession, admitting his full role in the recruitment network and naming everyone involved." The news was sad, but hardly unexpected given what they'd learned about her father's poor health and moral compromise. But there was clearly more to the story based on her expression and the official nature of the documents. The confession provided evidence that enabled federal authorities to seize assets from everyone involved in the criminal conspiracy across multiple territories. She continued scanning the legal language with growing amazement. And based on that testimony and the additional evidence we helped gather, the territorial government is paying substantial restitution to all identified victims and their families. "What kind of restitution are we talking about?" Bradley asked with professional interest and obvious concern for her welfare. Millie's hands trembled slightly as she found the relevant section that detailed the government's compensation offer. $300 in direct compensation for suffering endured and damages sustained, plus a land grant, 80 acres of prime farmland in Kansas, confiscated from one of the major recruiters and transferred free and clear with full legal title. $300 represented more money than most frontier families saw in several years of backbreaking work. 80 acres of established fertile farmland was enough to build a substantial and prosperous life upon enough to guarantee independence and security for decades to come. It was everything a woman in Millie's situation could reasonably hope to achieve, and considerably more than most victims of such crimes could ever expect to receive. It was also located nearly 1,000 miles away in Kansas, far from everything and everyone she'd come to care about in Dakota territory. The implications settled around them like morning mist on the prairie, heavy with possibility and change. Millie now possessed the financial means to start over anywhere she chose, to build whatever kind of life her heart desired, without depending on anyone else's charity or goodwill. She could return to Kansas and claim her substantial inheritance, establishing herself as an independent landowner with enough resources to live comfortably. Or she could take the money and travel west to California's opportunities, or back east to the growing cities where educated women could find professional opportunities and social advancement. She no longer had any practical or economic need to remain in a frontier settlement teaching children in a preservation facility, while helping a former warrior prepare food for winter storage. The choice was entirely hers to make, and everyone in the room understood the significance of what she was contemplating. "Congratulations," Bradley said quietly, genuine warmth evident in his voice, despite the complexity of the situation. "You've certainly earned the right to a fresh start wherever you choose to make it, with resources sufficient to build whatever kind of life you want." "Yes," Millie replied. But uncertainty colored her tone in ways that gave Wicasa hope, despite his understanding of what the smart choice would be for her. "I suppose I have earned that right through everything that's happened." She folded the official papers with careful precision and tucked them into her apron pocket, the gesture somehow final and temporary simultaneously. When she looked directly at Wicasa, he saw something in her expression that made his heart skip. Not the excitement of someone planning to leave, but the thoughtful calculation of someone weighing truly difficult choices that would affect the rest of her life. "I need some time to think about all of this carefully," she said. It's not a decision that should be made hastily or emotionally. Of course you do. It's potentially the most important decision you'll ever make. Would you be willing to help me think it through? I value your perspective more than anyone else's, and I want to make sure I consider all the relevant factors. The question seemed simple enough on the surface, but the implications were enormous and profound in ways that took his breath away. She was asking him to participate in her decision-making process, to have a voice in determining her future path. After everything they'd shared together, all the dangers they'd faced and challenges they'd overcome, she was offering him something more precious than money or land or legal documents. She was offering him a meaningful choice in what came next for both of them. I would be deeply honored to help you work through such an important decision, he said, his voice carrying all the sincerity he could manage. That evening found them sitting together on the steps of the preservation facility, watching the sun set over prairie grass that stretched endlessly toward horizons painted in shades of gold and purple and deep crimson. Somewhere in the settlement behind them, children were finishing their evening games, while adults completed the day's work life, proceeding with the quiet contentment of a community genuinely at peace with itself and its future. I could return to Kansas, Millie said, eventually breaking the comfortable silence between them with words that carried the weight of serious consideration. Claim the land grant, establish myself as an independent farmer, with enough resources to build something substantial. You certainly could do that, and you'd probably be very successful at it. Or I could take the money and go somewhere else entirely. Use it to get proper formal education, become a certified teacher in a real school with actual books and supplies and government support. That's also entirely possible, and you'd be excellent at that kind of work. She watched a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, riding the thermal currents in the cooling air with effortless grace that spoke of perfect adaptation to its environment. Or I could choose to stay here in Dakota Territory. Use the compensation money to help build something lasting for this community. A proper schoolhouse for the children, expanded preservation facilities, maybe even a small hospital to support Dr. Pike's work. That would certainly benefit the settlement considerably, and everyone here would be grateful for such contributions. Monora. But would it benefit you personally, Wikasa? Would it make you happy if I chose to stay here instead of pursuing opportunities that might be better for my own future? The direct question deserved an equally direct and completely honest answer, regardless of what such honesty might cost him personally. Wikasa thought carefully about the past month's morning lessons, interrupted by the need to check equipment and supplies, evening conversations that stretched deep into the night, and the way his simple preservation facility had gradually transformed into something that felt like a genuine home for the first time in years. Yes, he said without hesitation or qualification. It would benefit me very much indeed, and it would make me happier than I have any right to expect. But more than that, I think it would benefit you too in ways that might not be immediately obvious, but could prove more valuable than money or land in the long run. What do you mean? I mean that you've already built something here that's worth more than financial security or social advancement. You've built a place where your skills are genuinely valued, where your contributions make a real difference in people's lives, where you're respected and cared for, not because of what you own, but because of who you are. Millie smiled then, and in that expression, he could see the future beginning to take definite shape, not the desperate flight that had originally brought her to his door during that terrible blizzard, but a conscious and deliberate choice to build something new and meaningful, in a place where both their skills were truly valued, and their partnership could flourish. Then I believe I'll stay, she said simply, and the words carried the weight of final decision, made with full understanding of what she was choosing and what she was giving up. The wedding took place the following spring, when the prairie had exploded into wildflowers and the Dakota Territory sky seemed wide enough to hold every dream that had ever been dreamed under its vast expanse. It was a ceremony unlike anything the territory had ever witnessed, Lakota traditions woven seamlessly together with Christian customs, creating something entirely new that honored both cultures while pointing confidently toward a shared future. Wicasa wore traditional buckskin decorated with porcupine quill work that had been prepared specifically for the occasion by the women of his band, while Millie's dress was white cotton adorned with intricate beadwork created as a wedding gift by reservation artisans who'd come to respect her work with their children. The ceremony itself took place outdoors, under the open sky, with vows spoken in both English and Lakota, witnessed by earth and heaven, and every person who'd helped them survive to reach this moment of joy and commitment. But the real achievement wasn't the wedding ceremony itself. It was the fact that Lakota and white families sat together as invited guests and honored participants, children playing freely between the adults, while their parents shared food and stories and genuine hope for whatever the future might bring to their shared community. The apple pie Millie baked for the reception became legendary throughout 3 territories, but more important than the pie itself was what it represented: different traditions combined to create something new and wonderful, skills shared across cultural boundaries, partnership that honored the past while building confidently toward the future. As they cut the pie together, her hand resting over his on the knife handle, Wicasa thought about the scared, fever-sick woman who'd stumbled into his preservation facility during that terrible winter storm months ago. She'd been running from one life, without having any clear idea what she was running toward, driven by desperation and hope in equal measure. Now she knew. They both did. The pie was perfect naturally, like everything else they'd learned to build together through patience and determination and love that had grown stronger under pressure. In the end, that turned out to be the true victory over men like Avery and systems like debt bondage, not just stopping the evil when they encountered it, but building something better and more beautiful in its place, something that honored both their histories while creating space for entirely new stories to grow and flourish under the wide Dakota sky, stories that their children and grandchildren would tell with pride for generations to come.